Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on in 2020. And I got a lot of comments on the news. I actually just gave a presentation with a Ukrainian leftist and someone who heads the Boris Kagarlitsky Solidarity Campaign. He's a Russian socialist that Putin has jailed. That was Susie Weissman. So I prepared for that, and my notes are pretty scattered this time, but I'll just start. One thing I noticed this week is that Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil just got sentenced to 27 years in prison for trying to foment an insurrection like our January 6th attack on the Capitol that Trump inspired. And Bolsonaro's in prison. Trump is in the presidency. And we know that Biden's attorney general dragged his feet on prosecuting Trump for many obvious crimes and basically helped Trump run out the clock. So when he got reelected, all those pending indictments and indictments that he's under, most of them, except those that brought forward by states attorney general, Trump is untouchable. I mean, there's an unwritten rule at the DOJ that you don't prosecute incumbent presidents. And the Supreme Court, as we know, last summer before Trump was elected, basically gave immunity to the president for anything the president does while in office. So I just want to draw attention to that contrast. You know, the United States likes to talk about being one of the world's great democracies, but compare it to Brazil. It's really pathetic. And speaking about democracy, one thing I've noticed this week is a lot of people in New York are concerned that Trump is going to deploy the military to New York to try to rig the election against Zoran Mamdani. They could station military people outside polling places. They could call an emergency and make it difficult to administer the election. Who knows what they could do? But it's definitely something that civil liberties groups and people around Mamdani are worried about. We got the damn military marching. They're just now going into Memphis. We are really in a bad place. And now the far right has a martyr, Charlie Kirk. I really have no sympathy for this guy. He was a Klansman in a suit instead of a sheet. He said slavery was okay by the Bible, that black women don't have enough brain power to process to be in responsible positions. I mean, the guy was a stone cold racist, sexist, authoritarian. And unfortunately, the mass media is like making him out to be, a legitimate leader of conservatism. But he's really a martyr for the Christian nationalist fascist movement in this country. And of course, Trump is trying to weaponize it to attack the left. Now, the guy that apparently shot Charlie Kirk, Tyler Robinson, from what we know, and we don't know everything yet, but he appears to be neither left nor right, more a alienated gamer. And but Trump wants to go after all political opponents, not just the so-called, what we would think of as the left, the left that wants to change the system, but the center-right Democrats and the liberal Democrats, all the Democrats, as well as the radical anti-capitalist left. And he will call those Democrats the radical lunatics, but the lunatic left. But so I think it's already started. We already see establishment institutions doing this for Trump. Matthew Dowd, who was a conservative, he was the chief strategist for the Bush-Cheney campaign in 2004, was fired from MSNBC because he said remarks to the effect that, Charlie Kirk he sowed what he reaped in terms of his spewing of hatred. Several university administrations a PR guy for one of the NFL teams, elementary school teachers, and others have been fired for criticizing what Charlie Kirk stood for. This day or two ago, the UC Berkeley administration just sent out the names of 160 faculty and students that were pro-Palestinian to Trump's Department of Education Civil Rights Office under the pretext that they were anti-Semitic. This is the kind of thing that universities did in collapsing before the McCarthy era. And Berkeley, I mean, for God's sakes, that's where the free speech movement started. And that was about students wanting to organize civil rights actions on campus. And the university tried to shut it down, and the students wouldn't let them. And it was one of the key movements that sparked the student movement in the 1960s. That happened in 1964. And that's really where I started to come to political conscience, because, I heard on the TV that, the people like Ronald Reagan, who was getting ready to run for governor, was calling the free speech movement people communists. And these guys that they're actually going to San Francisco State, but they were working at the City Rec Center, the Martin Luther King, was now called the Martin Luther King Center. And, we talk about what was going on, and they said, no, these people, they just came back from Mississippi. They're civil rights workers. And, so that was one of the things that really started to open my mind to what was going on around me. And I'm afraid the political repression by the Trump administration is just going to intensify. And Charlie Kirk's murder will be the rationale. And I also am afraid that political violence will continue from the accelerationist right, the accelerationist left, and assorted lunatics who just want to be part of the action. I mean, we're really in a bad place. I got a report last night that right-wingers on social media in Salt Lake City were blaming the most prominent member of the DSA chapter, the Democratic Socialist America chapter in Salt Lake City, for radicalizing Tyler Robinson. There's no evidence there was any connection there. But these right-wingers were basically threatening this DSA person who, I happen to have the connection because DSA was one of the, I think it was 3 DSA chapters defied national and endorsed Angela Walker and me in the 2020 presidential election. So I heard about that. So, this guy got it from, where the right wingers are talking, on channels like 4chan, I think it's called, these right wing media channels. And, they were getting ready to threaten this DSA guy. So, I basically, be on the lookout and take care. Another thing this week is the Supreme Court basically legalized racial profiling by ICE, which is ironic and hypocritical, given that they've also told in previous decisions that colleges cannot consider race to support equal opportunity and enrolling a diverse student body. So, I think all of us understand the Supreme Court justices, the 6 right-wingers are, hypocrites. And, they will twist anything to get the result they want. They call themselves originalists, but they're activists, as the conservatives used to criticize the Warren Court that passed Brown v. Board of Education and so forth. And then Palestine, this is an important week. On September 18th is the deadline that the UN General Assembly gave for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territory, stop the war in Gaza. And obviously it hasn't. So there are competing, as I understand it, Uniting for Peace resolutions. Those are where the General Assembly, by a 2/3 vote, can authorize actions, including armed action to intervene, going around the UN Security Council, where the United States would veto any action against Israel. And there are really 2 competing perspectives on this. One is from France on behalf of the EU and Saudi Arabia on behalf of the Arab League, where they want to send in a peacekeeping force, but only after Israel accepts peace. And that's not going to happen. I mean, we just saw this week Israel bombed the Hamas negotiators in Qatar. That's to preempt any peace. So that, Israel's not going to do it. There is a resolution that Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, is putting forward for a protection force now. And that's the kind of thing I've talked on here, that Protect Palestine and Lifeline for Palestine, the group that Jill Stein's working with, are talking about a Uniting for Peace resolution that would send in forces to break the blockade on Gaza and protect the Palestinians in the rest of Israel, Palestine. Now, as I've said, militarily, I'm not sure how they could do it. Maybe, a naval armada could open up the Gaza Strip. I don't see how you could get a military force into the West Bank or Israel itself to protect Palestinians. So we'll see where that goes. But at least it's being discussed, and it's something to keep an eye on. And then I'll just say a few words, well, more than a few that I've already said about Ukraine and solidarity. These Trump meetings first with Putin and then with Zelensky and the European leaders, self-determination was not on the agenda. The Putin meeting was about business deals, and the meeting with the European leaders was about policing the partition of Ukraine, because Europe seems willing to accept what Trump is trying to get Putin to agree to, and that is a peace deal where the front lines are frozen, except that Ukraine is supposed to give Russia the rest of Donetsk province, which is 250,000 people, to bring them under Russian occupation. And then Ukraine is supposed to largely disarm and not have any military aid from any outside forces. And of course, that's unacceptable to Ukraine. That's basically surrender and capitulation. And then on the other side, the meeting with Putin was largely about business. Trump so-called minerals deal was more about oil and gas than rare earth minerals. There are gas fields in Ukraine and the Black Sea, and there are oil and gas pipelines that go through Ukraine to get oil and gas from Russia to Europe. And this minerals deal is about U.S. corporations getting a piece of the action and profits off of those businesses. And when, Putin and Trump met in Alaska, there was and maybe I'll add this to the chat, good article by Antonia Jusas, which in Rolling Stone, entitled Inside Putin's Fossil Fuel Victory Lap in Alaska, which elaborated on, the deals that were going on there. So in the lead up to that summit on August 5th, Putin issued a decree raising how much greenhouse gases Russia can emit. Russia's own paper committed to zero emissions by 2060, but they're not doing anything about that. They're trying to expand their oil and gas business. And then on the day of the summit, August 15th, Putin issued another decree opening up Russia back to Exxon and other Western oil corporations to resume their oil and gas business there. And then we find out on August 26th, according to a report in the Wall Street Journal, that Exxon had been in secret negotiations with Russia about returning to do their oil and gas business as soon as Trump was inaugurated. So, Trump has put all the pressure on Ukraine and none on Putin. And, Steve Witkoff, who's met with Putin 5 or 6 times, has brought back this proposal that I just outlined: freeze the contact line except for the rest of Donetsk province, and agree to largely disarm and forego any military aid and from any other country. And Trump has thought he could cut a deal with Putin to carve up Ukraine between him and Putin so they can get back to doing business as usual. And he thinks he has the leverage over Ukraine to force them to capitulate. But the fact is, Trump's already blown most of the leverage. That was the U.S. military, economic, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, which he's cut. All that's left is Trump is willing to sell weapons to Europe, which can get passed on to Ukraine. And they're providing intelligence of Russian troop movements, but only within Ukraine proper, not in Russia. So, Ukraine has been targeting, for example, oil refineries in Russia and trains with fuel and ammunition in Russia, but they're not getting help from U.S. intelligence for that. So the U.S. could still pull those, that the right or to sell weapons to Europeans for Ukraine and what intelligence the U.S. is still providing. So there's a little leverage. But Ukraine is not going to accept, just giving away 250,000 people to Russian occupation or being in a position where they can't defend themselves from a further Russian invasion. So, Trump thinks, and then on the Russian side, Trump thinks he can induce Putin to freeze the contact line where it is now, more or less, with the Witkoff proposals. Because he thinks Trump wants to do business. I mean, Putin wants to do business, but Putin wants Ukraine more than he wants business deals. Although I think Putin thinks he can keep playing Trump along and is betting that he can get the business deals without a peace deal. So, where does that leave us who are in solidarity with Ukraine? I think it's important, first of all, that we continue doing public education. This war looks like it's going to continue for years more. And we need to call out the campist and pacifist sellouts who want to sell out Ukraine to Russian imperialism in the interest of a so-called peace, but occupation is not peace. And this is where we need to talk to progressives about being consistent anti-imperialists. Oppose Israeli imperialism toward the Palestinians and Russian imperialism toward the Ukrainians, and imperialism everywhere. The campists and the pacifists have a strong presence on social media, and I think we need to contest them in every possible arena, not just progressive social media, but in our unions, in our local political groups. And we also, I think one thing we can argue is we need to expose the hypocrisy of solidarity with the Palestinians, but not the Ukrainians. And that's difficult given that, particularly under Biden, it was clear that the U.S. Was giving some support to the Ukrainians, but none to the Palestinians. And that hypocrisy undermines, because we get, they say, well, we're just like Biden. And they put us in the camp of that kind of imperialism, which we're not. And then the campists talk about a multipolarity. Let's put this in the chat, an article by Patrick Bond, where he argues that we need to be for anti-polarity, not just an inter-imperialist multipolarity of the kind that Putin is trying to sell. And by the way, Patrick Bond is going to be our guest next week. He's a political economist in South Africa who has been, deeply involved in the anti-apartheid movement, the so-called anti-globalization movement. I mean, he's more for a egalitarian, anti-polar globalization than this inter-imperialist or unipolar U.S.-dominated imperialism. Now, we know from polls that the vast majority of progressive-minded Americans, from the center to the liberal left, support Ukraine, but the radical left is divided. And I guess at this point it's about 50-50 on the radical left, judging from votes on resolutions related to Ukraine in the Green Party or in the Democratic Socialists of America. And I think we need to recognize that is a problem for the radical left, because progressive-minded Americans want nothing to do with the left that supports authoritarian leaders like Putin in his aggressive war in Ukraine. So that's a problem for us in advancing our politics among, the masses of Americans who are receptive to our program in other respects. So, winning the case for a consistent anti-imperialism is about the viability of a radical left in our country, as well as solidarity with the Ukrainians' struggle for self-determination. So that's the first thing. We need to keep doing education. I think another thing, given how Trump and Putin are trying to resume business as usual for oil and gas in Russia, we need to be working with the climate movement because, extracting and burning all this oil and gas from Russia is a climate bomb. It's, that oil and gas should stay in the ground. It shouldn't be burned if we're going to have any hope of mitigating climate change. So, if you're involved in climate movement groups, this is an issue to bring up. And of course, the goal is to get, really strong oil and gas sanctions on Russia so it defuels and defunds their military machine. And that's a second thing we can do. Another thing is material aid. I've posted, I can just get the link up later. We're doing in the Ukraine Solidarity Network now a fundraising for blood analyzers for nurses in Chernihiv with the Be Like We Are Nurses Union. And, the aid is valuable in itself, but it's also of psychological value to the Ukrainians. It shows them they're not facing the Russian invasion alone. And, in wars, the morale and psychological factors are often even more important than the weaponry people have. And the Ukrainians, they're tired, but they're determined. They feel like they got no choice. They just can't submit to Russian occupation after they've seen what happened in the occupied territories to the Ukrainians living there. The children are being abducted. The people that don't swear allegiance to Russia are detained and often beaten, tortured, sometimes killed, or just imprisoned. And, they can't speak Ukrainian. And I could go on. It's a human rights disaster. Now, the fourth thing I think we can do is we got to defend the Ukrainians and the anti-war Russians in the United States. Ukrainians, the Trump administration has wanted to deport them since they got in. They started moving that way in February. And then on August 15th, the same day as the Trump-Putin summit, about 120,000 Ukrainians who arrived here after August 16, 2023, saw their Uniting for Ukraine paroles lapse, which ended their work permits and is moving them toward the deportation process. There are another 160,000 Ukrainians who arrived before August 16th. And this is what Trump did as soon as he came into office, tried to remove their temporary protected status. But there was a court decision they won that extended it to October 19th, 2026, about a year from now. But they lose their work permits on April 19th next year, which means, how are they going to survive if they can't work? So, this is obscene. These are war refugees, and Trump wants to deport them back to the war. And then you've got the case of the Russian anti-war people. They are already being deported. 50 have already been sent back to Russia to face an uncertain fate, and 80 more are in the pipeline. You may have heard, I'll give you one case of Ksenia Petrova, who was an anti-war Russian, and she fled because she was being sought for making anti-war social media posts and attending some anti-war demonstrations when the full-scale invasion first happened. And she's a scientist with she knows how to. She studies genomes, and she's very good at computing. So when she got here, she was able to get a job at Harvard Medical School, and she went to France just before Putin, or just when when Trump came into office, and she brought back some frog embryos. And her colleagues said, don't tell customs. They'll probably let you in, and we need those for research. And they did ask her, and they found them. And so she was detained by ICE, and she did win bail in June. And then immediately the Trump administration, the Department of Justice, immediately charged her with smuggling frog embryos and lying to customs. So she's still in court. And, she is someone we were able to make contact through the Ukraine Solidarity Network. So when she had a court hearing in Vermont, we had people there to show support and show, the judge that there was public concern. And those are the kinds of things we can do. It's different in every place, but they're, Ukrainians and Russians all over the country. And, we should be in touch with these people and, offering our support so they aren't sent back. I mean, the Russians in particular, they'll get sent back and they'll be put into the, Russian prison system, which has thousands of anti-war political prisoners. So those are some of the things we can do. And those are some comments on current events. So let's talk about it. Let's see your questions and comments. Scout Trooper 164. Ukraine retook land from Pokrovsk after Russia had them encircled for a while. Any thoughts on how the Russian offensive got stalled, canceled? Yeah, it was in the Pokrovsk direction. It was another place called the Dnipropetrovsk or something like that. And Russians were able to infiltrate troops through the the Ukrainian defense lines and move something like 10 miles past the lines, but they got caught, and the Ukrainians counterattacked, and it basically sliced and diced them. And there are two groups of Russians that are encircled. The Ukrainians have taken a lot of principles, so that and now they're about to encircle another even bigger group. So that offensive by Russia has been defeated. And if you could, go back and look at press reports, and over a year ago, August last year, New York Times, Washington Post, the reporting was saying that the Russians are going to take Pokrovsk any day now or any week now. And, the Russians are hardly any closer than they were a year ago. There's a narrative that, Ukraine can't win the war, Ukraine is losing the war. The war is a stalemate. And, the Ukrainians do have problems. They are short on infantry, but they really ramped up their own weapons production, as the U.S. and Europe have not been as helpful as they should have been. And so Ukraine's becoming a lot more self-sufficient and smart. I mean, they're being very effective in hitting Russian, the oil refineries and the trains bringing munitions and fuel to the front. And I guess it was yesterday, Ukrainian missiles hit the command centers near Donetsk City or in Donetsk City of the Russians who are gathering for an offensive in the Pokrovsk direction. And that seems to have, severely disrupted Russia, which is, trying to amass troops there for another big offensive push. So, the narrative that Ukraine is losing is not really correct. Now, wars are unpredictable and anything could happen. But the fact is that the Ukrainians are doing an amazing job in defending and holding the front line against constant Russian offensives. What has changed in the last several months, really since May, is that the Russians have ramped up their bombing of civilian infrastructure and residential buildings in Ukrainian cities. This is just terrorism. And, it's hundreds of drones and, a dozen or two ballistic and cruise missiles. And, that has made it hard for people to sleep because every night they get these air raids and they have to seek shelter, and it disrupts their sleep. And sometimes it goes on all night. So, it's very difficult for the Ukrainians. But, the Russian offensive, it hasn't been canceled, but it's definitely stalled, and the Ukrainians are holding their own. We'll see what happens, but, I follow the military situation pretty closely. I think the Russians are going to have a hard time making much advances with their offensive this fall. The muddy season starts in a couple of weeks. So it's going to be hard for the Russians to grab more territory. And as I think I pointed out on this podcast previously, in all of 2024, when the Russians were on the offensive, they only took 0.69% of Ukraine's land. And if you look at over the course of the whole war, the Russians made a lot of advances in the first couple months of the war, and then Ukraine pushed them back out of the Kyiv region, out of Kharkiv, and out of Kherson, north or northwest of or what's they say on the right side of the Dnipro River. And that was about half the land that Russia had conquered. And that was by the end of fall 2022. Since then, it's just been a stalemate. And Putin keeps, sending people to die on that front. Over 1,000 Russian troops. They call them meat waves. They just assault Ukrainian positions and mostly drones, sometimes artillery, sometimes infantry, just wipe out these offensives by the Russians. And so they just keep running into a dead end, a literal dead end. That's been the course of the war, and it looks like it's going to be that way for a while longer. Simone Martis comments about the released political prisoners from Belarus and about Russian drones in Poland and Romania. Simone is somebody we had on this podcast. He's in Poland. He works with Ukraine Solidarity. I haven't looked at the released political prisoners from Belarus to have much comment. It looks like Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, is trying to, ease relationships with the West. So he released the prisoners. I'm not sure what he wants in return. I know, Shimon, you probably know a lot more about that than I do. About the Russian drones in Poland and now Romania. The analysis I've seen that makes sense to me is Russia is probing NATO's defenses and its will to resist, Russians if they get aggressive against other countries besides Ukraine or Ukraine itself. And it's very provocative. Trump said it was a mistake, but I don't know what he said about the Romanian drones, which were just last night, I guess. And the Europeans are talking a lot. They have moved some military assets into Poland. The Poles, I guess they closed their border with Belarus. And so the tensions are rising. And Shimon, I wish I had you on live to give your thoughts on that, because you probably know much more about it than me. But, those are things people should be looking at and watching. And, Putin and the Russians seem to be testing NATO to see how far they can go. And so, what that might mean for Ukraine might mean, even more aggression toward Ukrainian cities and civilians. So that's the best I can do, Shimon. Joanna Munley, Howie, do you have any concerns about Russia, China, and North Korea alliance? Yeah, I think it's part of the alliance of authoritarians that Trump wants to be part of. He's kind of like a kid with his nose against the window. They won't really let him in, although they're willing to, accommodate or let him accommodate them. And it's concerning. I think, there is a struggle. I mean, Biden said this, but it was totally hypocritical because of what he was doing in the case of Palestine. But, there is the leaders of Russia and China, and I haven't heard, Kim in North Korea say this, but they basically say democracy doesn't work. It's messy. You get changes of government. It's not efficient. And it's, you need the kind of quote unquote leadership that people like Putin and Xi can provide. And, I'm concerned that that's spreading to other countries. You look at, say, some of the African countries where they had military coups. Ironically, these people were trained by the U.S. and then they took power and kicked the U.S. and France out in fighting the Islamist insurgencies in their countries and brought in the Wagner Group from Russia, which is now called the Africa Corps, and it has been doing even worse in suppressing those insurgencies. Which, if we provided economic aid, because that's at the root of a lot of these conflicts between the pastoral Islamists and the agricultural Africans, is could be eased with real economic aid. But yeah, I have very concerns about that, deep concerns about that, because Putin has been supporting far right movements and parties in Europe, as now have Trump and Vance, like the Alternative for Democracy, Alternative for Germany in Deutschland and the AfD, National Rally, the fascist movement in France, and others, including certainly propagandistic aid, some business deals, and in the case of National Rally, a big loan to that party from Russia. And then Trump and Vance are supporting these same people politically. So I'm concerned not just about Russia, China, and North Korea, but the right wing in the U.S. wanting to be part of that alliance. Scout Trooper 164, Howie, do you have any thoughts on Russia suffering gas and oil shortages? While the lines are patient right now, I feel like folks in Moscow and St. Petersburg will get pissed in weeks to come. Yeah, I think that's probably the most effective thing that the Ukrainians have done is hit those oil refineries, and in some case, oil and gas pipelines, which has created these shortages that the Russian people are feeling, as well as the Russian military on the front lines. So I think it's a long-range campaign of bombing, and in some cases sabotage by covert groups. Some of them Russian, actually. Some of them Ukrainian special forces that go into Russia, particularly hitting the pipelines and the rail lines. It's effective, and it's I think helping Ukraine defend itself. Now, whether the people in Moscow and St. Petersburg are going to start an uprising over this, is hard to predict. Those kinds of uprisings tend to happen spontaneously and often when you least expect it. How solid the Putin regime really is hard to determine. They do polling, but people, are afraid to tell posters what they really think. Look at how Assad crumbled once, and his army, abandoned him once the HTS started moving down from Idlib province in December. So it's hard to predict, but it is possible that a lot of people start getting angry because waiting long lines in Russia, plus the inflation's going on. There are other reasons why this war is beginning to affect people's standard of living in Russia, and they may get upset with Putin about it. But how that manifests is hard to predict. Andrew Hager. Also, Howie, do you know of any solutions that can help lessen authoritarianism this alliance threatens to push onto the entire planet, thus secure international democracy and peace? Well, the kind of solution I've talked about, I ran on this, is that the U.S. should deeply cut its military spending. I said 75%. And by the way, the amount of military budget that's gone to Ukraine, and that includes what's promised, not what's delivered, was 2% of the military budget over the years that this war is going on. So we could cut the military budget by 25% and still support Ukraine. Probably be the best money the military was spending. And with that other 75%, which is, basically $750 billion, use that for a global Green New Deal. The U.S. should be the world's humanitarian superpower instead of its military superpower, and make friends instead of enemies, and help people get clean water and sewages and elementary education and basic health care, the kind of things the UN development, I forget what it's formally called, but they have development goals to meet basic standards of decent living, that when I've seen numbers put on that, the U.S. could meet that whole international budget for those basic needs with a small fraction of our military budget. I think if the U.S. did that, it would set an example that would, basically show that, this democracy, to the extent it still exists, can help the world's people instead of, intervening everywhere to protect our corporations' interests. So, that's a broad solution, but I think that's one. The other thing is, we should be promoting UN reform and international law. The system was set up, after the Holocaust in Germany to prevent aggressive wars and human rights violations and genocide. That's what international law stands for. We can force the U.S., demand that the U.S. adhere. They haven't signed all the treaties, and the ones they have signed, they're not following. Get the U.S. into the International Criminal Court and to the International Court of Justice or World Court, and then abide by those decisions. Support the International Criminal Court's warrants against Netanyahu and those other Israeli leaders, just like they do. Well, they did until Trump got here. The warrants against Putin and the military leaders that are responsible for the bombing and civilian deaths in Ukraine. There's 6 indictments against Russian leaders from the International Criminal Court. Yet Putin let Trump let Putin right into Alaska. When if we were part of the International Criminal Court, we'd have been obligated to arrest Putin and send him to The Hague. And Putin couldn't go to the BRICS conference in South Africa a few years ago because South Africa said, we signed the onto the International Criminal Court, and there's a warrant for your arrest. So if you come here, we might have to arrest you. So Putin had to zoom in rather than be there in person. So I would say we need, another solution is to promote international law. And then with respect to the UN, the Security Council veto allows the US imperialists or the Russian imperialists or the Chinese imperialists to oppose any joint US action when those imperialists violate international law by, wars of aggression. So, the Uniting for Peace process that the General Assembly can invoke should be supported, but also we should support reforming the Security Council, whether it means expanding it, limiting its veto, denying the right of countries that would be affected by action from exercising their veto. So, if it's an action against, say, Israel, where the U.S. is providing the arms, the U.S. would not, they'd have to recuse themselves or be recused. Same thing with the resolution against Russian aggression in Ukraine. The Russians should not be allowed to recuse themselves, but that leaves the Chinese. Although there's more and more evidence that they're supporting Russia, through, parts for weapons and maybe even weapons themselves. So certainly those golf carts, those electric carts that I guess they're electric, that the Russian infantry has been using to try to get to the front lines that come from China. So those are some thoughts on that. There are solutions. And then, generally, the bully pulpit, of our elected officials they should use it more, to promote international law and support democracies and, The U.S. is not doing it. They weren't doing it much under Biden, and they're certainly not doing it under Trump. Charles Keener, please mention the Gaza flotilla. Yeah, there's I don't know, it's the second or third flotilla this round. Is getting ready to go and try to open up and deliver humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. And last I heard, they've been bombed twice by what looked like drones, dropping munitions that are, start fires to try to burn these ships down. One of them hit a ship or a boat that Greta Thunberg was meeting with the other people leading this flotilla, and it hit that boat while she was in there. And then there was a second one. So this is, I think, a good symbolic action. It won't be hard for the Israeli Navy and military to stop the flotilla, but it demonstrates to world public opinion, the problem of this starvation and genocide in Gaza. So I think we should all, give our moral support to the flotilla. There are probably ways to send them funds. I don't have them handy, but that's another thing you could do. And let's hope they they're safe in their trip to Gaza. They'll probably be seized and arrested and so forth, but let's just hope that they aren't hurt. Scout Trooper 164, bonus question. I saw somewhere from Jake Bro that China is considering buying Russia's debts, which means if said companies go bankrupt, China will buy them up. Any thoughts on that? China, Russia's becoming a vassal of China. Russia sells them oil and gas and coal, and China sells them some parts, but China's basically got the upper hand in the relationship. So if China's saying they'll buy up the assets of companies going bankrupt, that will just make Russia more of a vassal of China. Lee Showron, do you even think that Vance will run, even though people keep wanting Trump to run again? Trump will do everything he can to make it where he can run, most likely. Yeah, Trump's health, I think, is an issue here. And the thing that he wants to stay in office so these prosecutions don't come back up. So I think Trump has every incentive. And we know that people in the Trump administration have talked about ways of getting around that amendment that limits presidents to 2 terms. And I think one of the things they'll argue is that's 2 consecutive terms, although the language of the amendment doesn't say that. And Vance, yeah, I think Vance would like to run if Trump doesn't. And maybe Trump will go with that, with the quid pro quo that Vance will make sure that the federal prosecutions of Trump stay away. There's a lot between now and 2028, like the 2026 midterms, which, just to talk about them for a minute, the Democrats could take back the House, even the Senate, but the House looks pretty good odds for that. Although Trump's trying to stop that with all this, voting ID stuff that he's trying to push from the federal government with dubious legality. And then the, political gerrymandering that he's encouraging Texas to do. And now there's gerrymandering wars between the states, which, by the way, is a good opportunity for us to talk about proportional representation and the Fair Representation Act in Congress, which would set up proportional ranked choice voting, proportional representation in Congress, which basically makes gerrymandering virtually impossible. So, that's something that is on the table that we can intervene with the call for proportional ranked choice voting for proportional representation. But, okay, so yeah, he might, what was I saying? The midterms. Yeah, Trump with the gerrymandering is trying to keep a Republican House. But the point is, there's not much more that Trump wants from the Congress. He got his big, beautiful bill with the Trump tax cuts extended and the social program slashed and the military budget increased. And really, he'll have another budget bill after the election, but he's not governing by legislation. He's governing by executive order, which then ends up in the courts. And when it gets to the Supreme Court, he often gets his way. So that's just something else to keep in mind. The midterms are not going to be the solution to Trump. They may, a Democratic House may put some road bumps, speed bumps on Trump's road, but it's not going to probably provide what we really need to stop, this neo-fascism we're getting from the Trump administration. It's going to require a lot more street action, defending immigrants, and right across the board. I mean, Social Security's up for contention, Medicaid's been slashed. I mean, housing is still too expensive. There's just so many issues we can fight on, and a lot of it's going to be done with social movements at this point. The House isn't going to help us, although we can hope, a Democratic House slows Trump down some. Anthony, Green Party. Hey, Anthony. Trump wants to lower interest rates. Yeah, so he wants to take over the Fed to make that happen. And that's a power grab. There's sort of a neoliberal orthodoxy that you want an independent central bank. I think that's debatable. You might want a central bank that is accountable to a democratically elected government, but not in the hands of the president, but including Congress. But that is, another power grab by Trump. He's trying to get Lisa Cook fired. I guess that's now in court. And I think he named somebody to take her place. I'm not sure where that stands, in terms of the process, but, it's a power grab. And then, if you lower interest rates without doing other things to deal with inflation, which Trump is not doing, he's increasing inflation with his tariff nonsense, and with the economy, looks like it's going toward a recession. So without increasing supply, prices are going to go up. There's just a lot of problems with Trump's economic plan, which may come back to bite him soon. So, lower interest rates, he wants to goose up the economy, so at least through his term. And, governments have done that, and you get runaway inflation. So there's a whole lot of issues around that, but I guess, the summary is that's part of Trump's power grab. He wants to bring the Federal Reserve under his tutelage, like he did the supposedly independent judiciary with the Supreme Court appointments. Vicky Corden, any thoughts about political assassinations are getting worse? Yeah, that's what I talked about up top. I said the right-wing accelerationists, accelerationists are political actors who think they can disrupt and accelerate movement in their way by creating chaos. And political assassinations are part of their accelerationist strategy. And, I'm afraid we're going to see it from the right. We might see it from the left. And we're going to see it from people that are neither left nor right, but kind of unhinged and alienated, Perhaps like this guy, Tyler Robinson, from what we know about him, he doesn't seem to have been, he came up in a Trumpist family, doesn't seem to have gone to the left. He seems more an alienated gamer from what we know. So, yeah, I think they're getting worse, and I'm afraid we're going to expect more, particularly given that, Trump is using Charlie Kirk as a martyr to rally the Christian nationalist fascist movement. And a lot of those people are going to take that as orders to get violent. And what I'm reading, it's secondhand. I haven't read it directly, but the right wing social media is saying, Charlie Kirk is the last straw. Now it's time to start a civil war. So like I said, when I talked about this earlier, take care and, provide security for your political work and your personal work. Don't think it can happen to you, because it's happening everywhere. I mentioned the Salt Lake City DSA folks who, one of those few DSA chapters that endorsed me in 2020, they're getting threatened by the right-wing nuts in Salt Lake City who want to blame them for radicalizing Tyler Robinson, which is certainly not true, but that's what they're saying. So, keep your head on a swivel and protect yourself. Andrew Hager. Speaking of a Green New Deal, Howie, I still stand by my beliefs that a Green New Deal solid fuel can be formulated and produced, as well as other biofuels. But for now, I'm willing to put all that aside, considering we've got bigger fish to fry. Okay, well, you did bring it up, so I'll just say there is a role for biofuels, I think, in niche areas, like capturing methane that would leak anyway from water treatment facilities and using that gas to power the water treatment facilities. And, I know you're fond of steam engines and railroads. Maybe we can use some fossil fuel for, a few of those as tourist and entertainment trains, but not for the regular train system. So, which should be electrified with power provided by renewable energy sources. Scout Trooper 164. Howie, I know you said before that we may have to worry about Vance if Trump dies. And while I partially agree, I don't think the same way. MAGA is based on hate, and by Trump's presence, much like Caesar's Legion from the Fallout, New Vegas. Not exactly his ideals. Plus, Vance, for all he looks, isn't as charismatic as Trump. If Vance were to become president, I have a feeling MAGA would fall. Not just because of the violence and bitter complaints, but because Vance isn't anywhere near as interesting as Trump. What I think would happen is that Vance would be your typical Republican president, but he wouldn't be anywhere near as popular due to his lack of charisma. Plus, the whole couch gag meme. Yeah, I've heard reference. I'm not familiar with the couch gag meme, but yeah, you're probably right. Vance doesn't have the same following that Trump has been able to accumulate. Which, I mean, I've always seen the guy as a shallow, self-seeking egotist. Even when he was first coming on the scene, and I read about him in the Village Voice back in the late 1970s. Just seemed like a very unattractive person, but he has a way of selling himself to, I guess, certain people. But yeah, Vance hasn't shown he can do that, so he can do that. So I think you're right. Vance wouldn't. I don't know if I would disagree that the MAGA movement would collapse, because the MAGA movement represents basically the old Confederacy in this country. It's the racists who used to be Dixiecrats, who used to have a lot of power, and back when George Wallace and Nixon were running against Humphrey, between the vote of maybe this was 72 with McGovern, I think it was 68. The vote for Nixon and Wallace was 62%. And Wallace was pretty open with his dog whistles. Nixon, not that much more subtle. So that was the MAGA base back then. Now the hardcore Trump support is, 30, at most 35%. The other Republican voters are people that wanted his tax cuts. They're the old country club Republicans. So I think the MAGA movement is diminished, but it's still significant. And, we're going to have to contend with it and continue, as we've done over the last, 60, 70 years, is defeat them in public opinion. So, if you look at the polls on tolerance toward racial minorities, women, immigrants, LGBTQ people, Americans have gotten more tolerant and accepting, but it's not inevitable, so we have to keep working at it. And so we're going to have to contend with the MAGA movement for a while longer, I'm afraid. Okay, well, we had a lot of questions from a lot of people, and I guess we didn't get to them all, but we'll be back next week. Although next week, as I mentioned, we'll have our guest, Patrick Bond, who is a South African political economist, long involved. I know him. He was actually going to school in the United States. He was on the Rainbow Youth Coalition, and I wrote an article critical of the Rainbow Coalition. And when I first met him later, this was in relation to anti-apartheid work. He said he was angry with my article, but he realized I was right. The Rainbow was going into the Democratic Party. And so, anti-globalization movement, and now he's in South Africa fighting the neoliberal turn of the ANC after it took power, and involved internationally in anti-globalization from below, BRICS from below, and has a lot to say. And let's put that article again in the chat that he wrote for Counterpunch on September 8th, where he talks about we need to fight for an anti-polar world, not a inter-imperialist multipolar world, which is the kind that Trump and Putin and Xi are fighting for. So he'll be a great guest next week. I hope you can make it then. Meanwhile, stay active. It makes a difference, and it makes you feel better too, because if you're just reading this stuff online, you can get pretty depressed. But if you go out and work with other people, you'll feel a lot better. So have a good week.